The last nail went into the poplar frame with a clean, final thud. Cole Merritt lowered the hammer, the worn hickory handle smooth and familiar in his calloused palm. He stepped back, his boots crunching on stray wood shavings, and surveyed his work. The house wasn't large, just 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, but it was solid. He had cut and stripped every log himself, hauled every river stone for the hearth, and set every pane of glass in the 2 small windows that faced the rising sun. It was a house built to stand against the wind, against the snow, against the crushing loneliness of the Wyoming high plains. It was a home built for one bride, Miss Evelyn Blythe. Her name felt foreign on the tongue, a name made of silk and parlors, not dirt and rawhide. He'd read her letter a dozen times, the script neat and careful on pale blue paper that still smelled faintly of Boston. She was a schoolteacher, modest and God-fearing, with no family left to speak of. Her photograph showed a serious young woman with her hair pulled back tight, her eyes looking out at the world as if it were a problem in arithmetic she intended to solve. In 3 weeks, she would step off the train in Laramie, leaving her world of brick buildings and crowded streets for this vast, empty sea of sagebrush and sky. Cole ran a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping like sandpaper. He hoped it would be enough. He hoped he would be enough. This land demanded more from a person than it ever gave back. The soil was a stubborn beast, all rock and clay, fighting the plow for every furrow. The nights grew cold enough to freeze a man's breath even in late summer, and the memory of the spring floods was still fresh, a muddy, roaring torrent that had torn out his lower fence and threatened to swallow the barn whole. But it was the isolation that ground a man down the most. Sometimes, the only sound for days on end was the ceaseless wind, a mournful whisper that worked its way into a man's bones and hollowed him out from the inside. He'd seen men go mad from it, their eyes growing distant until they started talking to ghosts in the shimmering heat haze. Marriage, he reasoned, was a practical matter. It was a bulwark against the madness. It was structure and warmth, the promise of a hot meal and a quiet voice in the darkness. It was the hope that this house, built with his own 2 hands, might finally feel like a home. He was coming back from his weekly supply run to town, the wagon wheels tracing a slow path through the dust. When he saw it, at first, it was just a heap of faded calico by the side of the road, a discarded bundle of rags. He pulled back on the reins, his horse, Jupiter, letting out a weary snort. It was a dangerous road to be careless on. Bandits weren't common this far out, but desperation was. He climbed down from the wagon, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was nothing, just the wind and the endless rolling plains. As he got closer, he saw the bundle was a woman. She was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. He nudged her shoulder gently with the toe of his boot. "Ma'am." No response. He knelt, the dry earth cracking under his weight, and rolled her over. Her face was pale beneath a layer of grime, her lips cracked and bluish, a dark, ugly bruise, faded to a sickly yellow-green, bloomed across her cheekbone and disappeared into her hairline. She was painfully thin. The bones of her wrist felt as fragile as a bird's when he reached down to check for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against his thumb. Her other hand was curled into a tight fist against her chest. He carefully pried her fingers open. Tucked inside her palm, held with a desperate strength, was a simple, unadorned wedding band, worn smooth and thin with time. He uncorked his canteen and dripped a little water onto her lips. Her eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly, revealing eyes the color of a stormy sky, clouded with confusion and then a sharp, animal fear. She tried to scramble backward, a small, choked gasp escaping her throat. "Easy now," Cole said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm not gonna hurt you. You need water." He offered the canteen again. This time, she drank, long. shuddering swallows that seemed to cause her pain. When she was done, she leaned back against the dry earth, her breathing ragged. "What's your name?" he asked. Her voice was a dry whisper, barely audible over the wind. "Clara." "Clara what?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away from his, fixing on some distant point on the horizon. "Garrison." "You got people waiting for you, Mrs. Garrison, a husband?" He nodded toward the ring still clutched in her hand. A shadow passed over her face, so profound it seemed to steal the light from the sky. "I'm a widow," she said, the words flat and devoid of emotion. "Family, then? Someone in town I can take you to?" She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. "There's no one left." The finality in her voice was absolute. It was a door slamming shut, a lock turning. He tried to ask what had happened, how she'd ended up on this road. But she fell silent, her jaw set in a stubborn line. All he could coax from her was that she had been walking for days, though from where and to what destination. She would not say. Her past was a locked room, and she had no intention of giving him the key. Cole found himself in a predicament. His life was a set of carefully laid plans, and a bruised, half-starved widow was not part of them. Every instinct told him to put her in the wagon, drop her at the sheriff's office in town, and wash his hands of the matter. He had a fiancée to think about, a future to protect. This woman, this Clara Garrison, was a complication, a loose thread that could unravel the whole tapestry. But then he looked at her, at the raw desperation etched onto her face, the way her hand trembled as she clutched that wedding band like a holy relic. The thought of leaving her here, or turning her over to the cold charity of the law, sat like a stone in his gut. His conscience, a stubborn and inconvenient thing, wouldn't allow it. "All right," he said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. "You can come with me, but I've got no room in the cabin." He was already building a wall between them. "You can stay in the hayloft for a few days, just until I can ask around in town, find some work for you." He felt the need to add the rest, to make his own situation clear, as much for his own benefit as for hers. My fiancé is due to arrive from the east in 3 weeks." Clara's gaze flickered to him, unreadable. There was no gratitude, no relief, just a quiet, weary acceptance. She nodded once, a barely perceptible motion, and allowed him to help her to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and he had to grip her arm to keep her from falling. She felt weightless, as if the wind could carry her away. The barn smelled of dry hay, leather, and horse. It was a clean, honest smell, the smell of work and purpose. Clara stood in the middle of the wide, packed earth floor, looking small and out of place. Cole climbed the ladder to the loft, then came back down with a spare blanket and an old wool-stuffed cot he used during calving season. He set it up in a clean corner, away from the draft. "It's not much," he said, not looking at her. "There's a pump outside for water." He handed her a piece of hardtack and a strip of jerky from his saddlebag. She took them without a word, her eyes fixed on the cot as if it were a featherbed in a fancy hotel. As he turned to leave, she spoke, her voice still a raw whisper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he grumbled, his back still to her. "Just stay put. I'll be in the cabin." He left her there, a solitary figure in the cavernous gloom of his barn, and retreated to the house he had built for another woman. He felt a strange unease, as if he had brought home a wild thing that might, at any moment, remember its teeth. He woke the next morning before dawn, as was his habit, but the usual silence was broken by a sound he didn't recognize, a rhythmic, determined thwack. Thwack! Thwack! It was uneven, lacking the efficient power of his own wood chopping, but it was persistent. He pulled on his boots and went outside. Clara was at the woodpile, wrestling with his heavy splitting axe. It was clearly too big for her, and she had to use her whole body to lift it. her thin frame straining with the effort. Her hair had come loose from its pins and fell in messy strands around her face, which was flushed with exertion. She brought the axe down, missing the center of the log but managing to shear off a respectable chunk of wood. She looked up and saw him standing there, her stormy eyes flashing with defiance. "I will not take charity, Mr. Merritt," she said, her voice stronger now. "I will earn my keep." He could see the blisters already rising on her palms, red and angry against the pale skin. "That's my axe," he said, his tone flat. "And my wood. You're a guest." "A guest doesn't sleep in a barn," she retorted, her chin lifting a notch. "I will work, or I will leave." He saw the iron will in her, a surprising and formidable thing. To argue would be pointless, and perhaps cruel. He let out a sigh that plumed in the cold morning air. "Fine," he said, "but you'll use the smaller axe, and you'll let me show you how to do it right before you put the broadside of it through your foot." A silent truce was declared. He showed her how to place the wood, how to swing from the shoulders, how to let the weight of the axe do the work. She was a quick study, her movements growing more confident and efficient with each swing. He left her to it and went about his own chores, but he was acutely aware of her presence, of the steady, rhythmic sound of her work that had replaced the familiar morning silence. That day, she moved from the woodpile to the cabin itself. While he was out mending a fence line, she swept the floors, scrubbed the small table until the grain of the wood showed through, and washed his few dishes. When he came in for his midday meal, a pot of something was bubbling on the stove. It was just beans and bacon, but it was hot, and it filled the small cabin with a savory aroma. They ate in their now customary silence. Sitting at opposite ends of the table, he was impressed, against his will, by her tireless energy. She worked as if she were trying to outrun a demon, pouring every ounce of her being into the simple, mindless tasks of survival. It was a kind of grit he understood and respected, but he kept his distance, the wall between them built of polite nods and single-word answers. He was a man with a fiancée on the way. He could not afford anything else. The day settled into this new, strange routine. They worked from sunup to sundown, two solitary figures moving in separate orbits around the homestead. He worked the land. She worked the home. They were close in proximity, yet miles apart. Their shared silence a landscape as vast and empty as the plains around them. But at night, the silence would break. After Clara had retreated to the barn and he was alone in the solid, quiet house, he would hear it, lying in the bed he had built for himself and his new bride. He would hear the sound of her weeping. It was never loud, never a wail of despair. It was a quiet, muffled sound. The sound of a grief so deep and so private it could only be let out in the dark. It was the sound of utter brokenness. The first time he heard it, he sat up, his first instinct to go to her, but he stopped himself. What could he say? What comfort could he offer a woman whose past was a locked door? It was her sorrow, not his. To intrude upon it felt like a trespass. So he would lie back down, clench his jaw, and stare into the darkness. Listening, he would pretend he couldn't hear it, but the sound seeped through the thick log walls, through the very air itself, a quiet testament to the pain that lived in his barn. Their silent, separate griefs hung in the air between the two buildings like smoke, mingling in the cold Wyoming night. A week later, the flour was running low, and he needed to fetch the mail. He had to go to town. He told Clara he would make inquiries at the Mercantile and Mrs. Gable's boarding house about hiring help. "I should come," she said, her voice firm. "It's best they see the person they might be hiring." He couldn't argue with her logic. The ride into town was a stiff, silent affair. Clara sat straight-backed on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple brown dress he had bought for her, along with some other necessities on his last trip. A garment chosen for its durability, not its beauty. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and her face was scrubbed clean. She looked respectable, but there was a tension in her posture. a guardedness in her eyes that spoke of a woman braced for a blow. In town, the blow came not as a shout, but as a series of whispers. He saw the looks as they walked toward the mercantile. The women who had been gossiping by the post office fell silent, their eyes following Clara with a cold, dissecting curiosity. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, gave Cole a questioning look over the top of his spectacles, while Clara was speaking quietly with Mrs. Henderson at the back of the store. Cole stood by the counter, waiting. A man named Silas Croft, a rancher from a neighboring valley, came in for tobacco. He nodded at Cole, then jerked his chin discreetly in Clara's direction. "New housekeeper?" Silas asked, his voice a low mutter. Cole just grunted in reply, not wanting to engage. Silas chuckled, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "Didn't think a man like you, Merritt, all set to be married, would take in a stray widow that easy." The words were not meant to be overheard, but the store was small, and sound carried. Cole saw Clara's shoulders stiffen. He saw a flicker of something, shame, or maybe rage, cross her face before she smoothed it away into a mask of polite indifference. A hot, unfamiliar anger rose in Cole's chest. He wanted to tell Silas to mind his own business, to defend Clara's honor. But what honor could he defend? He didn't even know her story. And what right did he have to defend her at all? Clara finished her conversation and walked back toward him, her head held high. She did not look at Silas Croft, nor at the other curious eyes that followed her. She met Cole's gaze, and for a second, he saw the deep, burning shame she was trying so hard to conceal. It was the shame of being judged, of being misunderstood, of being a woman alone and therefore vulnerable to the cruel assumptions of others. And in that moment, he felt a strange and unwelcome kinship with her. He, too, felt judged. The ride home was even quieter than the ride in. The town's gossip followed them, a toxic cloud that poisoned the air between them. That night, after a tense, silent supper, it was time for Cole to write his weekly letter to Miss Evelyn Blythe. He sat at the small, scrubbed table, the clean scent of lye soap still clinging to the wood. He dipped his pen in the inkwell, the blank page staring up at him like an accusation. He thought of what to write. He looked around the cabin. It was cleaner than it had ever been. A small jar on the windowsill held a few stubborn, late-blooming wildflowers. He knew, without asking, that Clara had put them there. His world was no longer the simple, solitary place it had been a week ago. It was now a world that contained a woman's quiet weeping, the judgment of his neighbors, and a jar of wildflowers on his windowsill. How could he explain any of that to a schoolteacher in Boston? How could he write, "Dear Evelyn, I have taken in a destitute widow who will not speak of her past. She sleeps in my barn and weeps in the night. The town thinks she is my mistress. I hope this finds you well." To write the truth felt like a betrayal of the neat and orderly future he had promised her. It would invite questions he had no answers for, and raise doubts that he himself was beginning to feel. So he wrote a lie. Not a direct lie, but a lie of omission, which felt heavier. Somehow, he wrote about the fence he had mended, about the price of corn, about the weather turning colder. He wrote about his anticipation of her arrival, and then, at the end, he wrote the words that sealed his deception. "The homestead is almost ready for you." He folded the letter and sealed it with a drop of wax. He watched the wax harden, a small, red circle on the clean white paper. His resolve, once as solid as the stone hearth he had built, now felt fragile. It had a crack in it, a fine, hairline fracture, and through that crack, the complications of the present were beginning to seep, threatening to stain the clean, bright promise of the future. The homestead began to change in ways so subtle Cole almost didn't notice them at first. It was a shift in the very air he breathed. The harsh, solitary silence of his cabin was slowly being replaced by something else, something softer. It started with the food. No longer did he eat cold jerky and hardtack for his midday meal. Now, when he came in from the fields, there was a pot of thick, savory stew simmering on the stove, filling the single room with a scent that spoke of care and time. He found himself looking forward to it, a knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach as he walked back to the cabin, a feeling he hadn't realized he was missing. Then came the curtains. They were nothing fancy, just old flour sacks bleached in the sun and hemmed with neat, even stitches. But when Clara hung them over the two small windows, they captured the morning light, diffusing it into a warm, gentle glow that softened the hard edges of the room. He came in one afternoon and saw them, and for a moment the place felt unfamiliar, as if he had walked into someone else's home. He said nothing about them, and neither did she. The curtains simply were a silent testament to her presence. Soon after, a battered tin can appeared on the windowsill, holding a small bouquet of purple asters and yellow goldenrod. The splash of color was a startling intrusion in his world of brown and gray, a small, defiant flicker of beauty against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The changes unsettled him. This was supposed to be Evelyn's domain. He had imagined her arranging the home, adding the touches that would transform his rough shelter into a civilized space. He had envisioned her surprise and delight as he presented her with a clean, blank canvas. Instead, Clara was painting on it, her quiet, steady brushstrokes creating a picture he had not intended. He felt a prickle of guilt, a sense of disloyalty to the woman whose photograph sat in a drawer, whose letters promised a neat and tidy future. Yet he could not bring himself to take down the curtains or throw out the wildflowers. To do so would feel like an act of cruelty, a rejection of the quiet dignity with which Clara was trying to piece her world back together. One night, the sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple. The wind, which usually just whispered, began to howl, rattling the window panes and shrieking around the corners of the cabin. A storm was coming, one of the violent, unpredictable tempests that could tear across the plains with the force of a physical blow. Cole secured the shutters and brought in extra wood for the hearth. From the cabin door, he could see the lantern in the barn flickering erratically. He thought of Clara, alone in the loft, with nothing but a few planks of wood between her and the fury of the storm. The first crack of lightning split the sky, followed a heartbeat later by a boom of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. He saw the lantern in the barn go out. He waited, his jaw tight, listening to the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain on the roof. Another bolt of lightning lit up the world in a stark, blue-white flash, and in that brief, terrifying moment of clarity, he saw the barn door thrown open and a figure running through the deluge toward the cabin. He opened the door just as she reached it. Clara stumbled inside, drenched and shivering, her hair plastered to her face. She didn't look at him. She went straight to the hearth, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her own trembling body together. "The wind tore the lantern from the hook," she said, her voice small and shaky. "It broke." "It's all right," he said, his own voice sounding rough in his ears. He shut the door, the sound a dull thud against the storm's fury. "You're safe here." He lit another lamp, his fingers fumbling with the match, the small flame trembling in his unsteady hand. The lamplight cast a warm, flickering glow over the room, pushing back the menacing darkness. Clara stood by the fire, her back to him, but he could see the way her simple dress clung to her, outlining the sharp, thin angles of her body. Water dripped from the hem of her skirt, forming a small puddle on the floorboards he had laid himself. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of rain, wet wool, and the unspoken tension between them. They sat there for hours as the storm raged outside, she on the small stool by the fire, and he in his chair a few feet away. They did not speak. There were no words for the space they now occupied, this fragile, temporary shelter from the world's violence. He watched the firelight play over her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way her lashes cast long shadows on her cheek. He was intensely aware of her proximity, of the shared warmth of the hearth, of the quiet rhythm of her breathing. He wondered what terrors the thunder dredged up for her, what ghosts the lightning illuminated in the dark corners of her past. He wanted to ask, to offer some small comfort, but he did not know how. Their silence was a wall he had helped to build, and he did not have the tools to tear it down. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. Clara left as soon as the sky began to lighten, slipping out of the cabin without a word and returning to the barn. But something had shifted between them. A line had been crossed, a boundary blurred. She had sought shelter in his home, and he had given it. It was a simple act, but it held a weight that neither of them could ignore. The next morning, Cole took his tools to the barn. He spent the better part of the day sawing and hammering, his movements precise and methodical. When he was finished, a new, proper ladder stood against the wall leading to the loft. It was made of smooth, sanded pine, with wide, sturdy rungs. It was a far cry from the rickety, makeshift ladder she had been using. When Clara saw it, she stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the ladder, then at Cole, who was busy brushing sawdust from his trousers, refusing to meet her eyes. "The old one wasn't safe," he said gruffly, by way of explanation. "A person could fall in the dark." She said nothing, but he saw the gratitude in her eyes, a shimmer of emotion that was more eloquent than any words. It was an apology and an acknowledgement, a recognition of her fear the night before. It was his way of saying he had heard her, even in the silence. A few days later, something new appeared on the windowsill next to the tin can of now fading wildflowers. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. Cole picked it up. It was whittled from a scrap of pine, the same wood he had used to build the ladder. It was smooth and warm in his palm. The next day, a carved leaf appeared beside it, its veins etched with painstaking detail. Then a star, then a crescent moon. Clara never mentioned them, and neither did he. She would leave them there in the quiet of the afternoon while he was out. Small, silent offerings on the altar of his windowsill. They were her way of speaking, a language of gratitude and artistry that bridged the silent gap between them. He never removed them. He would pick them up sometimes, turning them over in his rough fingers, marveling at the patience and skill they represented. They were Clara's mark on his home, small and unobtrusive, but undeniably present. The stagecoach from Laramie brought the telegram. Cole saw the rider coming from a long way off, a small plume of dust on the horizon. He felt a knot of cold dread form in his stomach. Telegrams rarely brought good news. He took the thin envelope, his hands feeling clumsy as he tore it open. The message was short, the words stark against the yellow paper. Evelyn Blythe arriving Laramie. Train due October 12th. 7 days. Stop. 7 days. The words echoed in the vast silence of the plains. 7 days until his promised future arrived. 7 days until Miss Evelyn Blythe of Boston stepped off the train, expecting to find a ready home and a ready fiancé. He stood there for a long time, the paper crinkling in his clenched fist, the wind whipping at his hair. He felt like a man standing on a cliff edge, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He had ordered his life like items from a catalog, and now the bill was coming due. He went back to the cabin and placed the telegram on the table, the stark words facing up. He could not bring himself to put it away. It was a fact, a deadline, a final, unchangeable truth. He went back out to work, splitting logs with a furious, desperate energy, trying to sweat out the anxiety that coiled in his gut. When he came in that evening, the cabin was quiet. Clara was nowhere to be seen. The telegram was still on the table, exactly where he had left it. He knew she must have seen it. There was a plate of food for him on the hearth, covered to keep it warm. He ate without tasting anything. That night, for the first time since the storm, He did not hear her come into the cabin to sleep on the floor. He looked out the window and saw the faint, flickering light of her lantern in the barn. She had read the message and understood. She had quietly retreated, re-establishing the boundary, reminding him of her place and of his. The small, fragile world they had built in the spaces between their words had been shattered by a single piece of paper. One of the heifers, a young one, went into labor 2 nights later. It was a difficult birth. The calf was breech, and the mother was growing weak, her lowing turning into ragged, exhausted groans. Cole worked for hours, his arms slick with sweat and birth fluid, but he couldn't get the calf turned. He was about to give up, to accept the loss of both mother and child, when the barn door creaked open. Clara stood there, holding a lantern, her face pale in the flickering light. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He was too tired to argue. "It's turned wrong," he said, his voice raw with frustration. "I can't get it." She didn't hesitate. She set down the lantern, rolled up her sleeves, and knelt beside him in the muck and straw. "My father raised cattle," she said simply. "Show me what you've done." For the next hour, they worked together, a grim, determined team. Her hands, though smaller than his, were surprisingly strong and sure. She was not squeamish, not afraid of the blood and the mess and the raw, primal struggle for life. She spoke to the struggling cow in a low, soothing murmur, her voice a strange and gentle counterpoint to the grim reality of their work. At last, with a final, desperate effort, they managed to turn the calf. A few minutes later, a small, slick body slid out into the straw. It was alive. The mother began to lick her calf clean, her rough tongue working with a renewed energy. Cole and Clara slumped back against the wall of the stall, drenched in sweat and mud, their bodies aching with exhaustion. He looked at her then. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair falling from its pins, her dress stained and ruined. But her eyes were shining with a fierce, triumphant light. In that moment, he did not see a pitiful, broken widow. He saw a woman of incredible strength, a woman who could face the messy, brutal reality of life and not flinch. He saw someone raw and fierce and powerfully, breathtakingly alive. The image of the stern, proper schoolteacher from Boston flickered in his mind and seemed to fade, becoming pale and insubstantial, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Clara made a trip into town alone the next day to buy thread. As she was leaving the mercantile, a woman approached her. Her name was Martha Peterson, a widow who lived in a small house at the edge of town and took in laundry to make ends meet. Her face was kind, but her eyes held the weary wisdom of a woman who had seen her share of hardship. "You're the one staying out at the Merritt place," she said, her voice low. It wasn't a question. Clara simply nodded. Martha's eyes softened with something that looked like pity. "I just wanted to say, be careful, dear. I've been in your position. A woman alone has to be." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening before continuing. "Men like Cole Merritt, the quiet, decent ones, they don't take in women like us just for charity. They do it because they want something, or worse, because they already have something to lose, and you're a risk they haven't calculated yet." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She had allowed herself to believe in Cole's simple decency, in his quiet kindness. She had let the sturdy ladder, the shared silence of the storm, and their teamwork in the barn build a fragile kind of trust. Now, Martha's words coated it all with a layer of suspicion. Was she just a convenience, a temporary comfort before his real life began? Or was she a danger to him, a complication he would soon discard? The shame she had felt before returned, sharp and bitter. That night, the weight of it all became too much. The deadline of the telegram, the raw intensity of the birth, the poison of the widow's warning. It all conspired to break through the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the smooth, sanded rungs a cruel reminder of a kindness that now felt suspect. She didn't bother with the cot. She collapsed onto a pile of loose hay, the scent of it filling her senses, and for the first time since she had arrived, she let the grief come. It wasn't the quiet, choked sobbing of the nights before. It was a raw, tearing sound, a storm of anguish that she could no longer contain. She wept for her lost husband, for the child she had never held, for the life that had been stolen from her. She wept for the shame of being judged in town, and for the fresh, new shame of being a fool who had dared to feel safe. She wept for the man downstairs, the man who was building a home for another woman, a man whose kindness she could no longer trust. Cole had gone out to the barn to check on the new calf. He stood in the shadows, listening to the soft sounds of the mother cow and her child, and then he heard it. The sound from the loft was not one he could ignore or pretend away. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart. He stood frozen, his heart aching with a pain that felt like his own. He knew he should leave. He knew he should walk away and give her the privacy of her grief. It was the decent thing to do. But he couldn't. Something inside him, something that had been shifting and changing ever since he found her on the road, would not let him walk away. He could not leave her alone in that darkness. He looked at the new ladder, his own handiwork, a bridge between his world and hers, and with a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, he placed his boot on the first rung and began to climb. His head cleared the edge of the loft, and he saw her. She was huddled in a nest of loose hay, her body curled into a tight ball of misery. The moonlight, slicing through the gaps in the barn wall, laid down bars of silver light across her trembling form. She wasn't sobbing anymore. A terrible, shuddering silence had fallen, which was somehow worse than the sound of her tears. At the scrape of his boot on the top rung of the ladder, her head snapped up. In the dim, striped light, her eyes were wide and luminous with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked like utter desolation. He climbed the rest of the way and stood before her, his large frame seeming to swallow the small space. He felt clumsy and out of place, an intruder in the sacred territory of her grief. He had no words of comfort, no easy platitudes to offer. All he had was his presence, a solid, undeniable fact in her world of shifting shadows. She slowly uncurled herself, rising to her knees in the hay. She looked at him, her gaze traveling over his face as if seeing him for the first time. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, filled with the scent of dry hay and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. Then she spoke. It was just one word, but it held the weight of all their unspoken days, all their shared silences. It was the first time she had ever said his name. Cole. The word was not a question, not an accusation. It was a sound of pure, unadorned despair, a frayed thread of a voice reaching out in the darkness. It broke something in him, some carefully constructed wall he had been hiding behind. "You deserve better than this. Clara," he said, his own voice a low rumble of gravel. "Better than sleeping in a barn. Better than all of it." He meant it as a kindness, an absolution. He was telling her that her pain was not her fault, that her current state was an injustice. But she heard something else. She heard him placing a distance between them, defining her as someone to be pitied, someone to be helped and sent on her way. She rose to her feet, the hay rustling around her ankles, and took a small, unsteady step toward him. The moonlight caught the defiant glint in her eyes. "You built a home," she said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "You built it for someone who has never felt the bite of this wind, never seen the color of this sky. Someone who hasn't even seen you yet, not the real you." She took another step, closing the space between them until she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "But I've seen everything. I've seen you work until your hands bleed. I've seen the kindness you try to hide. I've seen the loneliness in your eyes when you think no one is looking. I've seen it all, Cole. And I stayed." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She had seen him. In all his solitary years, he had felt invisible, a man defined only by his labor and his land. But she had seen him, the man underneath, and she had not run. The realization was a staggering, terrifying thing. It stripped away his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. The space between them crackled with a tension that had been building for weeks. It was in the shared meals, the silent work, the sound of her weeping in the night. It was the culmination of every glance, every unspoken thought, every small act of kindness. He looked down at her, at the bruise that had faded but was still a faint shadow on her cheek, at the fierce, wounded pride in her stormy eyes. And he knew he was lost. His duty, his carefully laid plans, his mail-order bride. It all dissolved into smoke, meaningless in the face of the woman standing before him. He didn't plan it. There was no thought, no decision. There was only a deep, primal instinct, a need as fundamental as drawing breath. He reached for her, his hands finding her waist, and pulled her to him. Her gasp was swallowed by his mouth. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate act of recognition, a collision of two solitudes. It was the taste of rain and salt and sorrow. They sank into the hay, a tangle of limbs and desperate need. There were no words. Words were for the world outside, the world of promises and consequences. In the dim, secret world of the hayloft, there was only this. They moved together in a silence that was more profound than any declaration. Their mouths pressed to each other as if to hush the world, to silence the guilt that was already beginning to scream in their minds. The hay rustled beneath them, a soft, conspiratorial whisper. Outside, the storm finally broke, the rain lashing against the roof, the thunder a low, angry growl. But inside, they burned together, two lost souls seeking a moment of shelter in a fire of their own making, ashamed and breathless and utterly consumed. Afterward, the silence returned, heavier now, laden with the weight of their transgression. Clara dressed without a word. She did not look at him, with a finality that felt like a judgment. She smoothed down her dress, turned, and went to her cot in the corner of the loft, pulling the thin blanket over herself. She lay perfectly still, her back to him. Cole stayed in the hay, the scent of her, of them, clinging to him. He stared up at the dark rafters, the moonlight now seeming cold and accusatory. Guilt, sharp and sickening, flooded him. It was a bitter, physical thing that churned in his stomach and clawed at his throat. He had broken his word. He had betrayed the trust of a woman he had never met, and he had taken advantage of the vulnerability of the woman lying only a few feet away. He was a man without honor. He slowly got to his feet, brushed the hay from his clothes, and climbed back down the ladder, each rung a step deeper into his own private hell. He stood on the barn floor, staring up at the empty space where she had been, a hollowed-out feeling echoing the emptiness in his own chest. The next few days were an exercise in quiet torture. They moved around each other like skittish animals, their bodies angled away, their eyes refusing to meet. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of what had happened in the loft. Meals were left on the hearth. Chores were done at odd, solitary hours. The silence that had once been a space of quiet companionship was now a weapon, a constant, screaming reminder of their shared sin. The telegram sat on the table, a stark, yellow rectangle counting down the days. 4 days. Evelyn would arrive in 4 days. On the 3rd day, Cole came in from the fields to find a small bundle of belongings tied up in a piece of cloth sitting by the door. Clara was standing by the hearth, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. A cold panic seized him. "Leaving? Where will you go?" "It doesn't matter. I can't stay here." He walked toward her, his boots loud on the floorboards. "Clara, don't!" The plea was ripped from him, raw and desperate. He couldn't bear the thought of this place without her. of the silence returning, colder and emptier than before. "Stay, please!" She finally turned to face him, and her eyes were bleak, devoid of the fire he had come to know. "Why? So I can watch you greet your new bride? So I can be your widow boarder and have the whole town whisper about us?" "No." She shook her head, a sharp, final gesture. "This was never mine. Not the house. Not you." The words were a knife in his gut, in a desperate, clumsy attempt to make her stay, to claim some right to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch of coins. It was most of what he had saved. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "This will help you get started somewhere. Just don't go." He saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes then, but it was not what he expected. It was a flash of pure, unadulterated fury. Her hand shot out, not to take the pouch, but to slap it from his grasp. The coins scattered across the floor, ringing and spinning on the wood before settling into silence. "You think you can pay me?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "For the cooking? For the cleaning? For that?" The unspoken question hung in the air between them, ugly and shameful. She looked from the coins on the floor to his face, her expression a mixture of hurt and disgust. She threw his own charity back in his face. It was a rejection of everything, a final, damning judgment on him and his fumbling attempt to fix what he had broken. Then she turned, picked up her small bundle, and walked out the door, leaving him alone with the scattered pieces of his honor glinting on the floor. He found her later, not on the road, but back in the loft. She had not left after all. She was on her knees by the cot, her hands clasped together, her head bowed. He stood at the bottom of the ladder, listening. She was praying, her whispered words too faint to make out, but the rhythm was that of a desperate, pleading prayer. It was not a prayer of hope, but a litany of sorrows, a quiet, desperate appeal to a silent heaven. That night, Cole did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes and drank until the edges of the world began to blur. The liquor did not bring numbness, only a sharper, more focused pain. In a drunken haze, his eyes fell upon the flour sack curtains she had made. They seemed to mock him, a symbol of the gentle, quiet home she had created, a home he was about to give to another woman. With a roar of pure, frustrated anguish, he lunged at the window. He tore the curtain from its nail, the fabric ripping in his hands. He looked at the neat, even stitches, the care she had put into such a simple thing, and he hated it. He hated it because it was hers. He stumbled to the fireplace and threw the curtain onto the glowing embers. The dry cloth caught immediately, flaring up in a bright, hungry flame. He watched it burn, watched her careful handiwork turn to black, curling ash. He was trying to kill the feeling, to burn her out of his house, out of his heart. He failed. The fire died down, but the smell of smoke lingered in the room, a ghost of his own destructive rage. The day arrived, bright and cold and painfully clear. He hitched Jupiter to the wagon, his hands moving with a mechanical slowness, his head pounding from the whiskey. He drove to Laramie in a fog of dread. The train pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and screeching of brakes. A monstrous, unstoppable machine delivering his future. A woman stepped down from the passenger car. She was just as her photograph had depicted, slender and pale, dressed in a dark, sensible traveling suit, her hair pinned in a severe bun. She carried a small, neat valise and looked out at the rough, bustling frontier town with wide, startled eyes. Miss Evelyn Blythe was delicate, polite, and looked as out of place as a porcelain doll set down in a blacksmith shop. He helped her into the wagon, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. She spoke of her journey from Boston in a soft, educated voice that seemed to be swallowed up by the vast Wyoming sky. As they approached the homestead, he saw Clara standing by the barn, her arms crossed, watching them come. She did not run or hide. She stood her ground, a silent, solitary figure against the backdrop of the plains. Evelyn saw her too. "Oh," she said, her voice holding a note of surprise. "You have help." "That's Mrs. Garrison," Cole said, the name feeling like ash in his mouth. "She's a widow. I've been letting her stay on for a bit, until she can find other arrangements." The words were a carefully constructed lie, a flimsy wall to hide the ruin behind it. He helped Evelyn down from the wagon. For a moment, the three of them stood in the yard, caught in a triangle of unbearable tension. Evelyn, the rightful bride, looked from Cole's grim, unreadable face to the woman by the barn, whose stormy eyes held a world of pain. She was a smart woman, a schoolteacher accustomed to observing the subtle dynamics of a room, and in the taut, electric silence of the Wyoming air. She noticed the unnerving stillness between her fiancé and the silent woman standing by the barn. Life on the Wyoming range was a language Evelyn Blythe did not speak. In Boston, she had been a woman of intellect and order, her days governed by books, timetables, and the quiet, civilized rustle of paper. Here, life was a physical, often brutal, assault on the senses. The wind had a voice, the sun had a fist, and the earth was an adversary. Her attempts to manage the small cabin were a series of quiet disasters. The sourdough starter, a living, breathing thing Clara had tried to explain, refused to cooperate, producing loaves of bread that were either flat, burned stones, or a gooey, inedible paste. The heavy cast-iron skillet was a torment, too heavy for her slender wrists, its surface either scorching the food to blackness or leaving it stubbornly raw. She looked at a horse not as a partner in labor, but as a large, unpredictable beast with terrifyingly big teeth. Her hands, accustomed to the smooth grip of a pen, were soon a testament to her inadequacy, marred by blisters from the scrub brush and small, angry red burns from the wood stove. She was not lazy or unwilling. She was simply unprepared. The skills required to survive in this world, the intuitive knowledge of seasons, the physical stamina for endless chores, the casual acceptance of dirt and death, were not things one learned in a finishing school. Cole was patient with her, his gruff kindness a constant, if distant, presence. But his patience felt like a form of pity, and it only served to highlight the chasm between the woman she was and the woman this life required her to be. It was Clara who quietly, methodically, began to bridge that chasm, despite the agony it caused her, an agony that twisted in her gut with every shared moment in the cabin. She became Evelyn's reluctant teacher. It was a strange and painful penance. She would guide Evelyn's soft hands, showing her how to properly knead dough, how to feel for the right consistency. "You have to feel it," she would say, her voice low and even. "It has to have life in it." She taught her how to regulate the temperamental heat of the stove, how to pluck a chicken with swift, efficient motions that Evelyn found both gruesome and fascinating, and how to mend Cole's work shirts with small, neat stitches that would hold against the strain of his labor. Evelyn, for her part, was a willing and grateful student. She was a woman who respected knowledge, and she saw in Clara a deep well of practical wisdom. She was blind to the undercurrents of pain and longing that defined every interaction. She saw only a competent, kind, and tragically widowed woman, and she expressed her gratitude openly. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Clara," she'd say, her smile genuine and bright. "Cole is so fortunate to have had your help in getting the place ready." Each word of praise was a fresh turn of the knife in Clara's heart. She was helping to build the life that should have been hers, preparing another woman to take a place she had only briefly and sinfully occupied. She would simply nod, her face an unreadable mask, and retreat to the solitude of the barn as soon as the lesson was over. As Evelyn began to feel more settled, the women from the surrounding ranches and the town began to pay their respects. They arrived in buckboards and wagons, bringing small gifts of preserves and offering unsolicited advice. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, and Mrs. Gable from the boarding house came together, their conversation a cheerful, chirping litany of recipes and warnings about the harsh winter to come. Then came Mrs. Croft, the wife of Silas Croft, the man who had made the cruel remark in the store weeks before. She was a sharp-featured woman with eyes that missed nothing. While Cole was out and Clara was in the barn, she took Evelyn aside on the pretense of admiring the view from the porch. "You've landed a good man, dear," she said, her voice a confidential whisper. "Cole Merritt is as steady as they come, but a man alone for so long gets set in his ways." She paused, letting the silence hang for a moment before delivering her payload. "And you'll want to be careful. The widow Garrison, she's been here a while now. She seems a bit too comfortable in her place. If you take my meaning, a woman has to guard what's hers out here." Clara was coming from the pump, a full bucket of water in each hand, and she heard the last part of Mrs. Croft's pronouncement. Too comfortable in her place. The words hit her with the sting of a slap. All her work, all her painful efforts to be helpful and unobtrusive, were seen as a kind of trespassing, a quiet, insidious encroachment. She was not a helper. She was a threat, the judgment of the town, which had simmered on the back burner of her worries, now boiled over. She set the buckets down so hard that water sloshed over the rims, turned without a word, and walked away from the house, away from the barn, away from the sounds of their voices. She walked until the homestead was just a small speck behind her, and then she kept walking, disappearing into the rolling, sage-covered hills. She didn't return that night. Cole, seeing the full buckets of water sitting abandoned in the yard and noticing her absence at supper, felt a familiar dread tighten in his chest. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that she had overheard something. After Evelyn had retired to her room, her face etched with a new, thoughtful worry. Cole took a lantern and went looking for her. He found her tracks easily and followed them up into the high country, the moon a cold, silver dollar in the black sky. She was sitting on a rocky ridge overlooking the valley, a small, solitary figure hunched against the vastness of the night. Her dress was smudged with dirt, and a thorny branch had torn a long rip in the hem. He saw a dark stain of dried blood on her heel where she had cut it on a sharp rock. She didn't seem to notice his approach until he was standing a few feet away. "You'll catch your death out here," he said, his voice quiet. She didn't look at him. "Sometimes a person needs to breathe air that other people haven't already used up," she replied, her voice rough with unshed tears. He stood beside her, the silence stretching between them, thick with the memory of the hayloft. He could no longer bear it. He had to give voice to the truth that had been haunting him every waking moment. "I never stopped thinking about that night. Clara," he confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "Not for a minute." She finally turned her head, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. Her eyes were filled with a profound and weary sadness. "Neither did I," she whispered. "But we don't speak of sins when the church bell is ringing. Cole, we just don't." It was an acknowledgement and a dismissal all at once. She was telling him that their truth was real, but it was a truth that had no place in the ordered world of daylight, of society, of vows and promises. He knelt in front of her, taking her cold, chapped hands in his. "I know," he said, but knowing didn't change the simple, undeniable fact of his heart. He leaned in and kissed her. It was nothing like the first time. There was no desperate, confused collision. This kiss was achingly gentle, a slow, deliberate expression of a longing so deep it felt like a part of his very soul. It was a recognition of a love that had grown in the silent spaces, a love that was as real and as solid as the rock beneath their feet, and it was utterly, hopelessly forbidden. She did not pull away. For a brief, stolen moment, she leaned into him, a soft, broken sound escaping her lips before she gently pushed him back. The kiss ended, leaving them more lost than before. A few days later, Evelyn was tidying the cabin, a task she had taken to with a determined, if clumsy, zeal. She was putting away a stack of freshly mended shirts for Cole, opening the bottom drawer of the small chest he had built, tucked away in the back, behind a set of winter woolens. Her fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. Curious. She pulled the objects out. There were 4 of them. A small, perfectly carved bird, a leaf with delicate veins, a star, and a crescent moon. She sat on the edge of the bed, turning the wooden tokens over in her palm. They were beautiful, crafted with a patient, loving hand. And in that moment, something clicked into place. She thought of Clara's quiet, artistic nature, the way her hands were never truly still. She thought of the townswoman's warning, of the unnerving tension she had felt between Cole and the widow from the very first day. These were not just trinkets. They were a secret, a story, a language she was only now beginning to understand. A cold, clear certainty settled in her heart. The history between her fiancé and the woman in his barn was deeper, more complex, and far more intimate than she had ever been led to believe. She carefully placed the carvings back in the drawer, covered them with the woolens, and closed it. She said nothing. Not yet. That Sunday, Cole hitched the wagon, and they all rode into town for church. It was an ordeal of public performance. Cole, stiff and somber in his Sunday best. Evelyn, a picture of quiet piety in a dark blue dress. Clara, sitting as far from them as she could on the wagon bench, her face pale and drawn. Inside the small, crowded church, they sat in the Merritt family pew, a living tableau of their complicated, untenable situation. The preacher, a fiery man named Reverend Davies, chose his sermon from the book of Isaiah. He spoke of sin, of wickedness that hides in the dark, and of the Lord's promise to cleanse the land with a purifying fire. "He will burn away your dross," the preacher thundered, his voice echoing off the wooden rafters. "He will smelt away your impurities, the secret sin, the hidden shame. It will all be brought into the light and consumed by the cleansing fire of his judgment." Every word was a lash against Clara's conscience. She sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her breathing growing shallow. The air in the church felt thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and hypocrisy. She felt the eyes of the congregation on her, felt their judgment like a physical weight. When the preacher spoke of the adulterous heart being turned to ash, a strangled gasp escaped her lips. She couldn't take it anymore. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor, and fled. She pushed her way out of the pew and ran down the aisle, bursting through the church doors and into the clean, empty air outside, leaving a wake of shocked silence and scandalized whispers behind her. Evelyn watched her go, her heart pounding in her chest. She stayed seated, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap, but she was trembling. She listened to the preacher's damning words, looked at Cole's stony profile beside her, and saw the whole, wretched truth laid bare. The carvings, the stolen kiss she now suspected, the flight from the church, it was all one story. The cleansing fire the preacher was shouting about was already burning, right here in this pew. That night, the fragile peace of the homestead was completely shattered, after a supper that no one touched. Evelyn waited until she heard Clara's quiet footsteps retreat to the barn. Then she turned to Cole, who was staring into the fireplace, at the empty space where the flour sack curtain had once hung. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud or hysterical. It was quiet, controlled, and as sharp as a shard of ice. "I have a question for you. Cole," she said. He turned slowly to face her. "When you sent for me, when you read my letters and looked at my photograph, what was it you saw?" She took a step closer, her eyes boring into his, demanding the truth. "Did you ever, for one moment, see me? Or was I just a solution to a problem? Was I just your salvation in a dress?" Cole stood there, trapped in the glare of her intelligent, wounded eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to offer some explanation that might soften the blow. but no words came. To lie to this woman, who had crossed a continent on the strength of his promise, felt like the cruelest sin of all. And the truth was too terrible to speak. His silence was his answer. It was a full and complete confession of his guilt, of his divided heart, of her place as a pawn in a game she never knew she was playing. A look of profound, quiet heartbreak passed over Evelyn's face. She didn't cry, she simply nodded, as if he had just confirmed a complex and tragic theorem. Without another word, she turned, walked to the door of the small room that had been meant for her, and went inside. A moment later, he heard the distinct, final sound of a bolt sliding home. She had locked her door. She had locked him out. The locked door became the new center of their universe. It was a solid, tangible barrier in a home suddenly filled with invisible walls. Evelyn established a routine of impeccable, cold politeness. She emerged from her room each morning, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression serene. She and Cole would share breakfast in a silence so profound he could hear the sound of his own heart beating. She was no longer his student in the ways of the frontier. She was a guest, a boarder in his house, waiting for a train that had not yet been scheduled. During the day, she took to writing letters. She sat at the small table for hours, her pen scratching across fine paper she had brought from Boston. They were long, detailed letters to a cousin back east, her only remaining family. Cole didn't need to read them to know their content. He could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed as she wrote, the way she would sometimes pause and look out the window at the harsh, unforgiving landscape with an expression of profound alienation. She was building an escape route, one word at a time, back to the orderly world of ledgers and ink, a world where love was a matter of proper courtship and life did not demand a constant, brutal negotiation with the elements. The cold truce of their household was broken by a threat that respected no locked doors. It started in the valley, a low whisper of a sickness that traveled from one isolated homestead to the next. They called it lung fever. It began with a cough, progressed to a debilitating weakness, and ended, for many, in a rattling, final breath. Fear, a far more contagious disease, spread faster than the illness itself. The crisis split the three inhabitants of the Merritt homestead into their essential roles. Evelyn, who had been raised in a city where disease was something managed by doctors behind closed doors, was terrified. The raw, intimate reality of the sickness, the sounds, the smells, the helplessness, sent her into a quiet, contained panic. She scrubbed the cabin obsessively with lye soap and boiled their drinking water twice, her movements quick and jerky with anxiety. Cole, ever the pragmatist, saw the sickness as a threat not just to people, but to his livelihood. A sick rancher couldn't work, and cattle, left untended, would wander, sicken, or be preyed upon. His first duty, as he saw it, was to the herd. He made the hard decision to drive the cattle north, into the high summer pastures where they would be safe and isolated until the sickness burned itself out. It was a lonely, arduous task that would take him away for a week or more. His departure left the two women alone, isolated in a landscape now haunted by the specter of death. Clara, however, was transformed by the crisis. Hardship was her native tongue. She had a kind of immunity, not of the body, but of the spirit, forged in a past that had already shown her the worst of what life could do. She was not afraid. While Evelyn scrubbed, Clara began to bake extra bread, while Evelyn boiled water. Clara began tearing old sheets into bandages. She had seen this before. She knew what was needed. News came that the Peterson family, their nearest neighbors to the east, had been struck down. Martha Peterson, the kind widow who had warned Clara in town, was now a widow twice over, her husband having been the first in the valley to fall. Now her young son was burning with fever. Without a word to Evelyn, Clara packed a satchel with bread. clean water, and medicinal herbs. She walked the 3 miles to the Peterson homestead, her steps firm and resolute. For 3 days and nights, she did not return. She moved like a phantom in the small, dark cabin, tending not only to the Peterson boy, but to 2 other families nearby. Going from one sickbed to the next, she spooned broth into mouths too weak to chew, wiped fevered brows with cool cloths, and sat through the long, dark hours. Her quiet, steady presence, a small anchor in a sea of delirium and fear. She worked until her bones ached, until her eyes burned from lack of sleep, until the world seemed to narrow to the single, desperate task of keeping a fragile flame of life from being extinguished. On the 4th day, the Peterson boy's fever finally broke. Clara, watching the sweat bead on his brow as a sign of life, not death, felt a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. She slumped into a chair, her own body humming with an exhausted, feverish heat she had been ignoring for days. She had pushed herself beyond the limits of her own strength, pouring her life force into others. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and slid from the chair into a heap on the floor, unconscious before she hit the rough-hewn planks. Cole returned that evening, bone-weary and grim. The northern drive a success. He unsaddled Jupiter and saw at once that something was wrong. The homestead was too quiet. A plate of untouched food sat on the porch, covered and cold. He found Evelyn in the cabin, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "It's Clara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She went to help the Petersons. She hasn't come back." He didn't wait. He remounted his tired horse and rode hard toward the Peterson place, a cold, sickening dread coiling in his gut. He found her there, Martha Peterson, weeping with a mixture of grief and gratitude, explained how Clara had saved her boy, how she had tended to half the valley, how she had simply collapsed from exhaustion. She was lying on the family's only bed, her face as white as the pillow slip, her breathing shallow. Cole stood over her, and the sight of her, so still and so fragile, broke through the last of his stoic defenses. He thought she was dead. In that moment, the carefully constructed world of his duties, his promises and his guilt collapsed into nothing. All that was left was the searing, unbearable truth of his love for this woman. A sound he had never made before, a raw, tearing sob, was ripped from his chest. He fell to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in the rough quilt, and wept. He wept for her, for himself, for the terrible, beautiful mess he had made of his life. He carried her home in his arms, wrapping her in blankets and holding her close against his chest as Jupiter walked the slow miles back to the homestead. He carried her not to the barn, but into the main cabin, through the front door, and laid her gently on the bed inside the room with the locked door, the room that was meant for Evelyn. Evelyn, her own fear forgotten in the face of this raw, undeniable tragedy. Helped him? She held the door, her face a mask of complex emotions, pity, sorrow, and a quiet, dawning understanding. Together, they tended to Clara, bathing her face with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of broth between her lips. They worked in a strange, silent truce. 2 women who loved the same man, united in their desperate effort to save the woman who stood between them. Clara's fever raged for 2 days, and then, like the boy she had saved, it broke. She woke to find herself in a strange bed, in a strange room with Evelyn sitting in a chair beside her, her hands busy with some mending. The crisis had passed. The sickness in the valley began to recede, leaving behind a wake of grief and a profound, communal exhaustion. And in its wake, the emotional landscape of the Merritt homestead was irrevocably altered. A week later, after Clara was strong enough to walk on her own again, Evelyn found Cole by the corral. She had her traveling valise in her hand. "The stagecoach passes through town tomorrow," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I've arranged for a seat." Cole just looked at her, his face weary. He had no arguments left. "I was wrong to come here," she said, not with bitterness, but with a sad, intellectual clarity. "I thought I was coming to a new life, but I was just a visitor in someone else's story." She looked at the house, the solid, sturdy structure he had built with his own hands. "Whatever you were building, Cole, it wasn't for me." Before he could respond, she walked toward the barn, where Clara was sitting on a bench in the sun, whittling a small piece of wood. The two women spoke for a long time, their voices too low for Cole to hear. He watched them, this impossible pair, the woman he was supposed to marry and the woman he loved, finding their own strange, quiet peace. When Evelyn returned, she walked past him and into the cabin to finish her packing. Later that afternoon, Clara came to him. "What did she say?" he asked. Clara looked down at the small, half-finished carving of a wolf in her hand. "She said to be happy." She paused, then looked up at him, her stormy eyes full of a new, different kind of pain. She said, "He built a home, but you were already living in it." Evelyn left the next day. Her departure was quiet and dignified. She shook Cole's hand, a formal, final gesture that severed their contract. The town gossips, of course, had their own version of the story. They called her the girl who couldn't compete with a ghost, a delicate Eastern flower who was scared off by the memory of Cole's first dead wife, a wife who had never existed. They painted Evelyn as a failure, a woman unequal to the task of taming the frontier, and a man. They never knew the truth. With Evelyn gone, an enormous, aching void opened up. The obstacle was gone, but the guilt remained. Cole went to Clara that evening as she was banking the fire for the night. "Stay," he said, the words raw and heavy with everything he couldn't say. "Marry me, Clara. This is your home." She turned from the fire, her face illuminated by the soft, red glow of the embers. The look in her eyes was one of profound sorrow. She shook her head. "No, Cole." "Why?" he begged, stepping toward her. "She's gone. It's over." "It's not over," she replied, her voice firm, grounded in a conviction that was absolute. "I won't do it. I can't be the woman who broke someone else's vows. I won't build my life on the foundation of another woman's tears. I won't." Her own past, filled with broken promises and abuse, had forged in her an ironclad sense of honor. She would not be the cause of another woman's pain, even if it meant sacrificing her own chance at happiness. Their stalemate was broken by the one thing that could unite a fractured community, a shared disaster. A lantern, knocked over in the livery stable late one night, sent a river of flame across the dry, dusty main street of the town. The volunteer fire bell began to ring, its frantic, clanging peal a scream of panic in the night. From his porch, Cole could see the angry orange glow against the sky. Without a word, he and Clara saddled their horses and rode hard toward the fire. The church, its tall, dry steeple a perfect torch, was already beginning to catch. The whole town was a chaotic scene of shouting men, weeping women, and a bucket brigade that was hopelessly outmatched by the inferno. As Cole joined the men trying to save the mercantile, Clara worked with the women, tending to the burned and carrying water. Suddenly, a woman's shriek cut through the roar of the fire. It was Sarah Croft, Silas Croft's young wife. "My boy!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the small vestry at the back of the church, which was now beginning to smolder. "He was asleep inside. He's still in there." The men looked at the building, at the smoke pouring from the eaves, and hesitated. It was a death trap, but Clara didn't hesitate. Before anyone could stop her, she soaked a blanket in a water trough, wrapped it around her head and shoulders, and ran into the burning building. The crowd held its breath. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The roof of the vestry began to groan, and then, just as a lick of flame burst through the window, The door was thrown open. Clara stumbled out, choking on the smoke, her dress smoldering, her arms and face blackened. But cradled in her arms was the small, coughing form of the Crofts' young son. She pushed the boy into his mother's arms and then collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking, her hands and one side of her face a mass of angry, blistering burns. Cole was at her side in an instant, lifting her, his heart in his throat. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. Silas Croft, the man who had mocked her, stood there with his mouth agape, his rescued son clinging to his leg. Mrs. Croft, the woman who had warned Evelyn about her, was weeping with gratitude. In the fiery, hellish light of the burning church, the town saw Clara Garrison for who she truly was. Not the scandalous widow, not the homewrecker, but a woman of quiet, ferocious courage. Their opinion of her, the one that had been carved in the stone of gossip and suspicion, was beginning to crack, quietly, begrudgingly, but irrevocably. The world for Clara narrowed to the four walls of the cabin, and then, for a long time, to the geography of the bed she lay in. The burns were a constant, searing pain, a fiery map of her heroism drawn across her hands and the left side of her face. Cole tended to her with a quiet, unwavering devotion that was more profound than any spoken declaration. He learned to change her bandages with a gentleness that belied his calloused, powerful hands. He brewed willow bark tea for the pain and sat by her bed through the long nights, a silent, sleepless guardian. They lived under one roof now, not as master and boarder, not as strangers, but as two people bound by a shared history of fire and fever. Yet the words they needed to say remained unspoken, trapped behind a wall of guilt and her unshakable, honorable refusal. The love between them was a palpable presence in the room, as real as the smell of the herbal salve he applied to her burns. But it had no name. It was a ghost that haunted the space between them, a truth they both acknowledged in silence. As she began to heal, a deep listlessness took hold of her. Her body was mending, but her spirit, the fierce, resilient core of her, seemed to have been banked like a fire. Her hands, when the bandages finally came off, were a lattice of pink, sensitive scars. They were hands that had cooked, cleaned, mended, delivered a calf, and pulled a child from a fire. Now, they lay idle in her lap, their purpose seemingly exhausted. She would sit for hours on the porch, staring out at the horizon, her expression distant and empty. Cole watched her, a knot of worry tightening in his chest. He saw that her physical wounds were the least of her injuries. The fire had burned away her defenses, and the ordeal with Evelyn had scorched her sense of worth. One morning, he went out after their silent breakfast and did not return for hours. She heard the rhythmic sound of a saw and the steady, punctuating blows of a hammer coming from the side of the house. Late in the afternoon, he came to the porch. "I made something for you," he said, his voice hesitant, almost shy. He led her to the east side of the cabin, to the spot just beneath the window where a tin can of wildflowers had once sat. There, he had built a small, sturdy carving bench. It was made of smooth sanded poplar, the legs sunk deep into the earth for stability. On the bench, he had laid out a new set of carving knives, their blades sharp and gleaming, and a neat stack of soft, workable wood. Clara stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the bench, then at him. It was not a grand gesture, not a gift of jewels or fancy dresses. It was something far more precious. It was a testament to the fact that he saw her, the real her. He had not just tended to her wounds. He was tending to her soul. He was giving her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost, the part that created small, beautiful things in a world that was often ugly. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a gratitude so profound it left her speechless. She could only nod, a gesture that conveyed all the thanks her heart could not speak. The next day, she sat at the bench, a piece of wood in her scarred hands. Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, she began to carve. The small, focused work seemed to draw the poison from her spirit. As the wood chips fell away to reveal the shape hidden within, her own emptiness began to recede. She carved the creatures of the plains, a hawk with outstretched wings, a coiled rattlesnake, a patient coyote. Each finished piece was a small victory, a reclamation of her own identity. They fell into a new rhythm, a life of quiet domesticity that was both comfortable and deeply painful. The unspoken love between them remained a constant, aching presence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence felt different, heavier. She had been staring into the flames, her latest carving of a lone wolf held loosely in her lap. "My husband," she began, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear her. "His name was Daniel." Cole remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement might shatter this fragile, long-awaited confidence. "He was not a kind man," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the fire. "He had a temper that was like a summer storm. It would come on fast and violent, and leave wreckage behind." She touched the faint, faded scar on her cheekbone. "He had a way of making me feel like I was the cause of the storm, that my own foolishness had called down the lightning." She told him everything then, the words tumbling out in a quiet, painful rush. She spoke of the loneliness, the fear, the constant, soul-crushing effort of trying to be small and invisible. She told him about the baby, a brief, flickering hope that had ended in a wave of blood and a grief so profound she thought it would drown her. Daniel had called her useless, a barren field, and her grief had been compounded by a terrible, corrosive shame. "I tried to leave once," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I saved up a little money, a few coins here and there. I was going to go to my sister in Colorado. He caught me just outside of town. He brought me back." The story of what happened next was in the shudder that ran through her body, in the way she wrapped her arms around herself. After that, there was nowhere left to run. When the fever took him, all I felt was relief, and I've been ashamed of that feeling ever since. I ran from that place with nothing but the clothes on my back and a wedding ring I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I was running from his ghost, from the shame. She finally looked up at him, her face stripped bare of all defenses, her eyes swimming with a grief and shame so deep he felt it in his own bones. She had given him the last, locked piece of her past. She had trusted him with her ugliest truths. Cole's heart ached with a love so fierce it was almost painful. He saw not a broken woman, but a survivor of unimaginable strength. He reached across the space between them and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the scarred skin. "I would have waited a lifetime," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I'd known you were coming instead, I would have waited a lifetime." His words were an absolution. They were not pity. They were a validation of her, a rewriting of his own history. His waiting hadn't been for a stranger from Boston. It had been a long, unwitting vigil for her. The shame she had carried for so long finally began to loosen its grip, washed away by the simple, profound power of his acceptance. A few nights later, a full moon hung in the sky, bathing the homestead in a soft, ethereal light. After they had banked the fire, Cole took her hand. "Come with me," he said. He led her not to her room, but out into the cool night air, toward the barn. He led her to the ladder, his hand resting on the small of her back. It was a silent, mutual understanding. They had to go back to the place where their story had truly begun. They climbed into the hayloft. The air was sweet with the scent of dried clover. Moonlight streamed through the slats in the wall, just as it had that first night, but everything was different. The air was not charged with desperation and a coming storm. It was still and calm and filled with a quiet reverence. They stood in a patch of silver light, facing each other. The memory of their first encounter lingered in the air, a ghost of the people they had been. But now, when he looked at her, He felt not a trace of guilt, only a deep, abiding love. This was not about shame anymore. This was about love. "Clara," he said, his voice full of all the words he had held back for so long. He reached up and gently cupped her scarred cheek in his hand. "I love you." "I love you, Cole," she whispered. The words a release, a final surrender to the truth of her own heart. He kissed her then. It was a kiss that held all the pain and all the healing, all the sorrow and all the hope. They were older now, more wounded by life than they had been on that first night, but their love was honest, forged in fire and tested by honor. It was a quiet, certain thing, as real and enduring as the land around them. They were married a week later. At sunrise, there were no guests. There was only the preacher from the half-rebuilt church, who had come out at Cole's request, a new day dawning over the high plains, and a new curtain Clara had sewn herself, hanging proudly in the cabin window. She wore a simple blue dress, and he wore his Sunday best, and they exchanged their vows as the sky turned from purple to rose to a brilliant, hopeful gold. That afternoon, Cole took her newest carving, the proud, resilient wolf, and placed it on the mantelpiece, right beside the hearth. He stepped back, his arm around her waist, and looked at the small, wooden token that had now claimed its rightful place in the heart of the home. "Now," he said, his voice soft. "Now the home is real." Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The townsfolk, when they came into town for supplies, began to call her Mrs. Merritt. Some said it with a newfound, grudging respect, the memory of her bravery at the fire having outweighed their initial judgment. Others said it with a lingering bitterness, their gossip now turning to the poor girl from Boston who couldn't hold on to her man. But Clara, standing beside Cole in the mercantile, her head held high, smiled through it all. The whispers of others were no match for the quiet, steady truth of her own happiness. One evening, as the last light of day bled from the sky, she found herself drawn to the barn. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the place of her deepest shame and her greatest joy. She stood barefoot in the soft, clean hay, the moonlight once again striping the floor with silver. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of home, of peace, of a future she had never dared to imagine. And in the quiet of the Wyoming night, she whispered his name once more, not in shame, not in desperation, but in a pure, simple, and unadulterated joy. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Feel free to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.